Okay, so welcome everyone to the American Irish Historical Society and the Irish American Heritage Museum's online presentation from author and writer Timothy Bohen, who is the author of Against the Grain, The History of Buffalo's First Ward, and his new book, which I have actually here on my desk, Emerald Thread, The Irish in New York. Um, this presentation is going to talk to you about the famous Irish Buffalonians. And, of course, we know that the Irish were all over New York and all over the Eastern Seaboard. So he's going to talk about the lengthy transition kind of this immigrant community. He has appeared on C-SPAN and in different PBS productions. And of course, his Irish ancestors settled in Buffalo. Some of them came as early as the Great Hunger in 1849. And he and his wife still live in Elmwood Village in Buffalo. And I'm just going to say while I'm on, those of you who are able to travel live to us, we're here in the Society on Saturday at 2 o'clock for a special reading of Letters of a Matchmaker by John B. Keane to celebrate St. Patrick's or St. Valentine's Day. We're not quite at St. Patrick's Day yet. And then on Wednesday, the 19th, we're in-house with a presentation from two Irish professors about Bad Bridget's, the life of Irish immigrant women. So we're doing the next three things are all in person only, but we'll revert to some of the online talks afterwards. So thanks very much, Tim. I'm going to hand it over to you and stay silent until the end. Those of you who are online, you can ask questions by using the chat feature or the Q&A feature, and we hope to hear from you soon. We'll answer the questions at the end of the presentation. So thanks and welcome, Tim.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for everything you do to promote Irish and Irish American history. This is a great opportunity. I've been to the Society headquarters once. It's one of the most beautiful buildings I've been in, and hope to be able to come back again. So thank you. I don't know when you sleep. You do so many of these activities. I don't know how you keep it all straight, but a big thank you. So yeah, this image here is the cover of my book, Emerald Thread: The Irish in Buffalo. I love this photo. It comes from the first ward of Buffalo, kind of the mother community of the Irish who settled in Buffalo. This is where my paternal ancestors landed. This photo is from about 1910. Some school children in the center of the street. There's a trolley car in the back. There's a horse and a wagon, giant grain elevators off to the right, and just kind of that misty, nostalgic look. So hope you like it. So how did I come to write this history? Quite literally, about 17 years ago, my father shared with me that our last name wasn't always Bohen. I knew I was Irish through and through on both sides of my family. Didn't sound like an Irish name, so he sent me to my aunt. I went to her house. She showed me a family history of some typed up notes. The answer wasn't there. But what I found out was even more fascinating, this great neighborhood called the First Ward of Buffalo. I went there. I decided that I would write a short history for my family. I found out more and more people were from this mother community, and I ended up publishing a book on the topic of this neighborhood, and it's now 12 years later in its eighth printing. So, not that this is that important of a detail, but some people ask me, well, what was the correct spelling of your last name? And I finally found it in a land deed. And my great great grandfather, Timothy Bohan, was from Skibbereen, County Cork, born somewhere between 1848 and 1850. So at the end of the famine, that image there is from Skibbereen, obviously one of the most devastated areas of Ireland. And those names underneath, Bohan, Bohen, and then finally in 1900 became Bowen. Those were the various spellings because he could neither read nor write. The census takers and the city directory folks were going trying to spell it phonetically. So after finishing that book, I never planned on writing another book, but people were saying, "Oh, you've got to write about the Irish in South Buffalo, the West Side, North Buffalo." So I said, you know what? All right, I'm going to take what I did, some of the highlights from the first ward, and I'll put it together, a comprehensive history, 200-year history of the Irish in Buffalo, and that's how I came about to write Emerald Thread. It came out in November. So, where did I get the title? I searched for years. I was trying to figure out something that showed that the Irish rose in all facets of life. And then I came across a 2019 speech from Nancy Pelosi on the 100th anniversary of the Irish Parliament, the Dáil. And she said in her speech, for generations, Ireland has been the emerald thread in the fabric of American history and national life. And I said, that's it. So people seem to like the title. And then I just went with a simple subtitle. So why did the Irish thrive in Buffalo? Why did they come? Why did they stay? Why are they still thriving? Those are some of the points that I want to convey in, the next 35 minutes or so. A couple of highlights, things that we'll talk about. Jobs were plentiful. If you know about Buffalo's geography, it was on the eastern end of Lake Erie. You couldn't get goods over Niagara Falls, so it couldn't go any further east. So all the goods from the Midwest had to be broken down in Buffalo. Catholic Church provided a strong social safety net, charitable organizations. We spoke the English language, so we had a head start over the Poles, Italians, Germans. We also brought our storytelling tradition from Ireland, great with oral and written word. Journalists and entertainers as well as politicians, were some of the professions that the Buffalo Irish did very well in. We also arrived before the Italians and Poles. Those are two of the big immigrant groups in Buffalo. So we were able to seize the leadership of the Catholic Church as well as the Democratic Party. And we were very hesitant to let that go. In politics as well, another area the Irish did very well. And from that, it wasn't just the power of politics, it was the civil service jobs that they were able to dole out, helping the laboring class get into the middle class. And then that thirst for justice, after being ruled by the English for 800 years and having endured the famine, Irish went into the fields of law, judges, labor movement, etc. So where did the Irish that ended up in Buffalo, where did they come from? Well, two informal studies that have been done by going person by person. It's over half came from five counties. About 60% came from counties in the South and the West, areas most devastated by the famine. County Cork is number one, Clare, Kerry, Mayo, and Limerick in terms of actual numbers that settled in Buffalo. The first Irish Catholic family, the O'Rourke's, came in 1815. They actually came from Albany and settled in Buffalo after the War of 1812. The largest in terms of numbers came in the 1850s decade. Of course, the Irish kept coming to Buffalo throughout the 19th century, well into the 20th century, even after World War II. Now it's dried out very much, just a handful maybe each year. But as recent as 2023, Buffalo is still ranked the sixth largest for U.S. cities for Irish ancestry in terms of percentage of the population. So still a very important Irish American community. So why did they come and what did they do? Well, as I mentioned, the geography issue being on the eastern end of the Great Lakes, and that all changed in 1959 with the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway. That was kind of the beginning of the decline of Buffalo. Now you didn't have to do all of this loading and unloading and processing in Buffalo. You could go through Canada. But up until that point, thousands of workers were needed to load and unload grain. This image here are Irish workers in the hull of a grain ship scooping the grain up into a grain elevator. Buffalo is the sixth largest port in the world in 1900 in terms of tonnage. It was the ninth largest U.S. city in the same year. It was the grain capital of the world. It was second in railroads behind Chicago. It was second in milling behind Minneapolis. And the Irish dominated these trades as well as longshoremen, any of the goods, other goods that had to be loaded and unloaded. Irish women in that era worked as domestics, boarding house owners, saloon owners, anything they could to supplement the family income, and of course later became teachers and nurses, and now in all facets of life. So Irish neighborhoods in Buffalo, where did they settle when they came? Well, they stuck to their places of occupation, which was along the water. So that if you can see the letter A, that is canal side. D above that is the west side of Buffalo, also along the water. The Beecher community right along the lake. They built their houses right on the shore of the lake. That was B. C, you see the first ward. And then F is South Buffalo, which is still kind of a mother community of the Irish in Western New York. They were hemmed in by geography because of the lake, because of rivers, because of railroads. There was some downside to it in a sense that, they were a little insular, but they also formed these really, really strong communities. And as I said, some of which still exist 150 years later. And most of the majority of the Irish Americans in Western New York are still south of downtown now in suburbs. So it's funny how those early years impacted even 200 years later where they live. So we'll start kind of at the beginning. As many of us know, the Irish Catholics weren't the first people from Ireland. The first waves were the Scotch Irish. That gentleman on the left is Samuel Wilkeson, Scotch Irish Presbyterian, who came up after the War of 1812, decided this was a place that he could start his businesses, very successful businessman. He also was the first judge of Erie County, eventually a mayor. But really, what makes him so important is he led the effort to build the first man-made harbor on the Great Lakes. He also, with his friend DeWitt Clinton, made sure that Buffalo became the western terminus of the Erie Canal, which, of course, is the reason many Buffalo Irish are still in Western New York. It's because of the success of that canal. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention this is the 200th anniversary of the opening of the Erie Canal. That etching that you see there is from Lockport, New York, just north of Buffalo. 1,000 Irish laborers, Catholics and Protestants came and were, this is one of the hardest parts of the Erie Canal, as was Montezuma, as was the aqueduct in Rochester. This is where they brought in the Irish laborers and they had to blast before dynamite with blasting powder 8 miles of solid rock. Injuries, deaths were very common. There were living conditions were horrible. There were two riots. It was the first time in North American history that the militia had to be called in to quell a riot up in Lockport. Of course, these Irish canal workers went on to build railroads and highways and a lot of the infrastructure in communities like Buffalo. The famine immigrants. This is really the only time you're going to have to look at numbers in this presentation. But the numbers are really kind of startling. So the famine immigrants come, of course, in the mid 1840s into the 50s, 1850s. The Irish never made more than 20% of Buffalo's population, but in 1850, over half of the people in the poorhouse were Irish. Two-thirds of the Irish men around the same time lacked steady year-round jobs. These were seasonal jobs on the waterfront. Half of the people on relief in Buffalo were Irish. 40% of the people in the county jail were Irish. They were overrepresented in what they called insane asylums, mental health facilities of the day. So very, very difficult situation. Fortunately, there was a strong Catholic church in Western New York. Uh, Archbishop John Hughes from New York City described the famine immigrants as the poorest, most wretched, scattered debris of the Irish nation. Some people said that they were like a different species of people than came from Ireland just the generation before them. The Catholic sisters, with the help and leadership of the bishops, built a network of hospitals, orphanages, schools, mental health institutions, school for deaf. You see Mother Veronica O'Brien. She was one of the co-founders of Buffalo's first hospital, Sisters of Charity Hospital. She also founded Rochester's first hospital, St. Mary's. So Protestant leaders had talked about opening a hospital, but it wasn't until the Irish sisters came that it actually got done. And as I mentioned, the Irish dominated the hierarchy of the church for the first 150 years of Buffalo's diocese. Only Irish or Irish American men served as bishops, and that's Bishop John Timon, who started it. Many of Bishop Timon's institutions that he started in the 1850s, 1860s still exist in some form today. So both Catholics and non-Catholics have benefited greatly from the church. Well, not only did they have to deal with poverty, but they had to deal with the nativists. Americans will and shall rule America was something that Millard Fillmore, who, by the way, was from Buffalo, he was one of the favorite sons of Buffalo, who decided to run as president on the American Party, the Know Nothing Party, in 1856. Fortunately, the nativists lost, but they wanted to restrict Irish immigration to America, how long it would take to get citizenship, that the Irish couldn't hold political office, etc. So that must have been very difficult for the people to have this person that's so revered and well respected in your community kind of rooting against you. The Fenian Raid. I don't know how many people are listening are familiar with this, but this is one of the most interesting intersections between Buffalo and Irish history. This image, they say, is not very accurate of what happened, but on June 1st, 1866, former Confederate and Union soldiers de departed from Buffalo, crossed the Niagara River into Canada. It was a multi-pronged strategy to capture Canada and hold it ransom for Ireland's freedom. They actually won the first battle against Crown forces. General Grant prevented more reinforcements from crossing the river. So, unfortunately, after a couple of days, they had to retreat back to Buffalo. So while this was a failure, it was just one part of the machine that eventually led to Irish independence. In fact, from the Fenians came the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and 50 years later, with the Easter Rising, of course, we know they finally were able to secure Ireland's freedom. Because of Buffalo's geography, being on the border with Canada, it was often a place for national and international meetings having to do with Irish welfare, having to do with Irish independence. Thomas D'Arcy McGee, who was a one-time resident of Buffalo, held the Emigrant Aid Convention in 1856 with delegates from all over North America. They wanted to come up with a scheme to get the Irish out of these urban areas onto farming communities in the Midwest. Of course, the Fenian Raid, which I just mentioned, Fenian national meetings happened in Buffalo in the 1860s and 70s. The Land League national meeting was in Buffalo in 1881, and James Mooney, a Irish immigrant and businessman, became the president of that organization for a few years. Clan na Gael, 1888 national meeting, Sinn Féin, 1908 national meeting in Buffalo, and the United Irish League with John Redmond came with a delegation from Ireland in 1910, and that occurred in Buffalo. John Murphy, a County Cork businessman who lived in Buffalo, was one of the representatives in Versailles during the Paris Peace Conference, advocating on behalf of Irish independence. So a lot of intersections between Buffalo and the Irish independence movement. Now I'm going to focus on a couple areas of where the Irish really shined. And my book, An Emerald Thread, has 15 chapters. This is just a few of the areas that I thought that people might be interested in, maybe will recognize some of the people I'm going to mention. You can see the list of the topics. We'll get right into it. So, the Sheehan brothers, they're sons of County Cork immigrants raised in the First Ward. They both become lawyers in Buffalo. They also run kind of a Tammany Hall Democratic machine, very corrupt politics. John Sheehan is the controller of the city of Buffalo, and then when Mayor Grover Cleveland becomes the mayor, he uncovers that Sheehan had been stealing from the city coffers. So John Sheehan rushes off to New York City to kind of get out of jail, and he becomes the police commissioner in New York City. That's it's crazy but true. He was replaced by the reformer Teddy Roosevelt. Sheehan also gets involved with Tammany politics. He eventually becomes the head of Tammany for a few years when boss Croker had to flee to Ireland. when things with a corruption investigation were getting hot. So he became a very wealthy man from skimming from some illegal activities. His younger brother, Blue-Eyed Billy Sheehan, a little bit cleaner profile. He learns from his older brother. Uh, Sheehan is the head of the New York State Assembly. He's the youngest lieutenant governor at age 33. He's the shoo-in to be the U.S. Senator from New York until an upstart legislator named FDR steps in and says, no, we don't want this corrupt band anymore. But he went on to become a multimillionaire Wall Street lawyer. All kinds of major companies had him on the board. It was more of kind of a payoff so that he could use his political connections to help the businesses. So, not two of our best exports, but very interesting characters. Modern day, a little bit cleaner politicians. On the left is Paul Fitzpatrick. He was the New York State Democratic chairman in 1944. He did that for about 8 years. And why he's interesting, similar to Blue-Eyed Billy Sheehan, who pushed for his law partner Alton B. Parker to be the Democratic nominee in 1904, who ended up losing uh, in a bad way to Teddy Roosevelt. Fitzpatrick and Peter Crotty also uh, played a part in national elections. Fitzpatrick in 1944 was able to uh, push off a delegation in New York that did not want FDR to run for a fourth term. Fitzpatrick insisted that he did, and of course, he went on to win. Similarly, in 1948, Harry S. Truman was the candidate Fitzpatrick wanted. Once again, there was a group that did not want Harry S. Truman to be the candidate. Fitzpatrick, with the help of Bronx leader Ed Flynn, was able to sway the committee. And of course, we know that Truman went on to win in 1948. Truman flew seven of his closest supporters down to the Key West, and Paul Fitzpatrick was on that plane. Similarly, Peter Crotty was the Erie County Democratic chairman. He's there on the left in that photo. This is in front of City Hall when JFK came to Buffalo. It's Kennedy, of course, on the right. Um, Ted Kennedy came to Buffalo several times after his brother was assassinated, and reminded people that Peter Crotty was the first Democratic leader in the nation to support JFK's nomination in 1960. Once again, Kennedy was not the preferred candidate by many of the New York delegates. So, with the help of Bronx boss Charlie Buckley, the two of them were able to sway that delegation. And of course, JFK became president. On the right is Kathy Courtney Hochul, who's the granddaughter of County Kerry immigrants, one of many trailblazing Irish women. Of course, she became the first elected female governor of New York State in its 244-year history. So it's interesting. It wasn't somebody from downstate where you would assume, and major city like New York, but from upstate. And she's still, of course, the head of New York State. War heroes, of course, we know the Scotch Irish and the Irish were overrepresented in our military over the years. On the left, that's Harry S. Truman pinning Wild Bill Donovan, one of many medals that Donovan was awarded. He was, of course, a World War I hero. He led the New York 165th Infantry in France, also known as the Fighting 69th. They made a movie about him and his company. He then went on after the war to become a lawyer on Wall Street until right at the beginning of World War II, his friend and classmate from Columbia College, FDR, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, called him up and said, I want you to form a centralized intelligence agency, which he did. It was called the OSS, which had some success during the war. And then after the war, it was called the CIA. Donovan's portrait still hangs first at Langley, and he's considered the father of modern American intelligence. He also was the first American to be awarded the highest four medals that are given out by the government. On the right is C. Wade McCluskey, who came from South Buffalo, one of the heroes from the Battle of Midway, which changed the complete trajectory of the Pacific Campaign in World War II. He was leading as lieutenant commander, two dive bomb squads. They were there to intercept the Japanese fleet. It wasn't there. He had to decide, do I go south towards Midway? Do I go north? His instincts said, I'm going to go north. He did, and they were able to destroy the Japanese fleet. At the end, four aircraft carriers were destroyed, hundreds of planes, hundreds of the Japanese best aviators, and Japan never recovered from that battle. Journalists, as I mentioned, the written and oral word is one of the things that comes from the Celtic culture. Jack O'Brien grew up dirt poor in the First Ward, didn't even graduate from college, but had a knack for writing, moved to Manhattan, took over the Voice of Broadway column, which appeared in 1,400 newspapers across the country. He broke the quiz show 21 scandal that it was all fabricated. He also was a ardent anti-communist who hounded actors and TV producers that he thought were soft on communism. Margaret Sullivan in the middle was the first female top editor of the Buffalo News, which was also founded by an Irish American, Edward Butler. She also went on to become the public editor of the New York Times, the media columnist for the Washington Post. Now she currently is a executive director at the Craig Newmark Center at Columbia Journalism School, so still connected to New York City. On the right, hopefully, many people recognize Tim Russert, who grew up in a working class household in South Buffalo, kind of one of the pride of South Buffalo, pride of Buffalo, really. And of course, the New York connection with him is he was U.S. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan's chief of staff and legal counsel. That's from that he got involved with NBC News and then became the moderator for Meet the Press, where he became the top TV political journalist of his day. Won all kinds of awards. Also became a national celebrity during the 2000 presidential campaign when people tuned in to find out what was going on with the George W. Bush and Al Gore presidential campaign. Died young, unfortunately, but very, very generous to Buffalo. All of his colleagues and even his competitors said that he was the best of the best in what he did. Entertainers. So you have George Christie on the left. This is also not one of our most commendable exports to New York City. Definitely noteworthy. He and his stepfather, E.P. Christie, formed a minstrel troupe in Buffalo in 1842 in the Canal District, wildly successful. They ended up taking their show to Manhattan and quickly became the premier minstrel troupe in Manhattan and really even across the United States, which this was the dominant form of entertainment in the 19th century, even though we look at it now as reprehensible. But they performed at the on Broadway at Mechanics Hall for 7 years, 2,900 performances. They bragged that they would turn 1,000 people away at night. Some people said that everybody in New York had seen their show at one time or another. Um, his stepfather, E.P. Christie, codified the structure of minstrel shows into this organized three-act performance. They both had their songbooks that they published, became very, very wealthy. They both also died very young, kind of in tragic situations. In the middle, Kitty O'Neill was a dancing prodigy as early as age 6. She also was born in the Canal District and raised in the Canal District, kind of a rough and tumble area in just north of the First Ward in Buffalo. She was hired by Tony Pastor at age 16 to come to New York and perform at his Bowery Opera House, where she became the star dancer in New York. Sold out shows. All of the working class men and boys loved to watch Kitty O'Neill dance. She did that for a couple decades, came back to Buffalo, where she managed her properties in a theater, died very young, unfortunately. At her death, the New York Times referred to her as the best jig dancer in the world. She was great at the Irish reel, sand jig, straight jig, clog, just a phenomenal dancer. On the right, from the same neighborhood, the Canal District, came Chauncey Olcott. If you're not familiar with his name, you certainly know his songs. So his mother was born in County Cork. He was raised by his mother, and he was a minstrel singer. He soured on it. He then went to get involved with comedic operas, and he co-wrote When Irish Eyes Are Smiling. He wrote My Wild Irish Rose, Mother Machree. He introduced a lot of the Irish American canon, Tour Allure Allure, songs like that. He became one of the wealthiest, most successful actors, Irish or non-Irish, in America in his day. He had a townhouse in Manhattan, a summer house in Saratoga, a winter house in Monaco with a Rolls Royce and a driver. But he was really, really humble man. He and his wife were very, very philanthropic, very generous. And one of the things he wanted to do, why he makes him so important, is he wanted to eliminate this stereotype, this kind of Irish stock character that the Irish were lazy and simpletons. And he really devoted his life to showing the world the genius of the Irish. And I think he definitely contributed to that. And of course, writers. So once again, back to the oral and written word. F. Scott Fitzgerald, a lot of people associate him with St. Paul, which is where he was born. Much of his youth was spent in Buffalo, New York. It's here where he really started to show signs of being an exceptional writer, where he really started to like the attention he got from writing. It's also where his middle class family went to school with wealthy people, where he realized that the very rich are different than you and me. Where he was able to go to clubs, but his family wasn't allowed to join the clubs. Part of it, maybe their Catholic faith. And it's also where he learned about the illusion of the American dream, because it was in Buffalo that his father lost his job from Procter and Gamble. And he said his dad, after that event, was a ruined man, was never bounced back. The family had to move back to St. Paul, be taken care of by the grandfather. And those themes, those things that he learned in Buffalo, really became themes that showed up in his work. The Great Gatsby, Tender as the Night was what Fitzgerald thought was his masterpiece. It wasn't, but that was has semi-autobiographical aspects. The protagonist comes from Buffalo, rises, falls, and ends back up in Buffalo in Western New York. Bridget Hughes in the center, daughter of Irish immigrants raised in Western New York, became the first female top editor of the prestigious the Paris Review. She then went on to create a public space, which she still runs, another literary magazine in Brooklyn, which has done wonders at finding and uncovering emerging writers that we may never have heard of, people like Jesmyn Ward and Yi Yun Lee, just to name two. On the right, Stephen Talty, son of Irish immigrants, raised in South Buffalo. I'd probably written about 12 books, some of them bestsellers. His one book went on to become Captain Phillips, starring Tom Hanks. Another one of his books on the Irish Mafia, The Black Hand. The rights for that were purchased by Leonardo DiCaprio. So he also is based outside of New York. While we're speaking of writers, another one of the interesting Buffalo Irish connections is that the university at Buffalo has the world's largest collection of James Joyce materials. How this happened is interesting. In 1949, a UB professor was on sabbatical in Paris, and there was an exhibition of Joyce's materials after he passed away. Of course, Europe is broke from the war. America has the money. He comes back and urges UB to purchase this collection of Joyce memorabilia. They do. Multiple more installments are purchased as well. Sylvia Beach, who's in the photo next to Joyce, his publisher of Ulysses, then donates two more installments to UB. So now, as I mentioned, they have the largest collection of, they have the family portraits, oil portraits of all of his ancestors, working papers, his notebooks, galley proofs. They have his cane, his passport, his eyeglasses, first editions of all of his works, photographs, etc. And now, thanks to Governor Kathy Hochul and Congressman Tim Kennedy, there will be a museum on the South Campus of UB, a $10 million museum to showcase this. All the Irish actors, poets, politicians that come to Buffalo or near Buffalo come and do a pilgrimage at this collection. So something we're very proud of. Athletes, of course, the Irish, great athletes in all different cities. Jimmy Collins, raised in Buffalo, Hall of Fame third baseman. He gets hired by the Boston Americans, where he's the manager and the third baseman all at the same time. He leads his team to win the very first ever World Series in 1903. He's still considered one of the greatest third basemen in the history of the game. Ended up coming back to Buffalo after his career, but a very, very interesting, humble guy. In the middle, Jimmy Slattery. Um, Held from the first ward. He became the world light heavyweight champion in 1927. People like Jimmy Braddock, who was in the Cinderella Man, said that in his opinion, Slattery was the greatest boxer of his time. Jim Corbett, the great boxer, said Slattery is the most perfect fighting machine I have ever seen. Um, Sports Illustrated 1992 ranked him seventh as the slickest boxer of all time behind Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray Leonard. He was also the favorite of New York City sports writers. He fought in front of crowds at Madison Square Garden, Yankee Stadium. Sadly, he had kind of a Shakespearean tragic end. He just could not beat his battle with alcoholism. Died at a young age, penniless, but a very, very generous guy who gave anybody that was in need whatever he had. So still kind of looked at as a hero 100 years later. And then Jim Kelly, born in Pennsylvania, but has made Western New York his home. Of course, led the Buffalo Bills to four Super Bowls, still a record. Unfortunately, we came up short in each one of them, but he's still a hero both on and off field. He's very, very generous for children charity that he runs, as well as cancer research, etc. So these are just a couple. There's many more Irish men and women from Buffalo that have been champions, but in the interest of time, cover those three. Couple more connections between the Buffalo Irish and New York City. Two very interesting guys, ruthless businessmen. And the picture on the left, that's Patrick Powers. He is a County Waterford immigrant who was raised in Buffalo. He does everything, laborer, policeman. Then he sees these Nickelodeons. He buys a couple Nickelodeons. He then figures out a way to merge sound and visual for cartoons. He sells this machine to Walt Disney, who then produces the first sound cartoon, A Steamboat Willie, using Powers equipment. He asks Powers to distribute the cartoons as well, so he makes some money from that. He forms Powers Pictures, a movie house, moves to New York City. He then merges that with four other companies, and that becomes Universal Pictures. Carl Laemmle purchases him out, makes him a fortune. Laemmle, of course, moves Universal Pictures to California. But a very, very interesting guy, had an estate in Connecticut, buried back in Buffalo. Daniel O'Day, County Clare immigrant, raised on a farm south of Buffalo in Ellicottville. He gets hired by John D. Rockefeller to form a monopoly in the transportation of oil. He became one of Rockefeller's closest associates, probably within the top five closest associates of Rockefeller, and he does what he's asked to do with ruthless efficiency. He hires Irish gangs to threaten oil producers if they don't go on to Rockefeller's system. They're laying pipe all over the Northeast, and they end up creating a monopoly in oil. O'Day also figures out how to move natural gas safely across long distances, and then Rockefeller gets a monopoly in that as well. O'Day moves to Manhattan, where he has a townhouse. He also builds what was called the Pride of the Jersey Shore in Deal, New Jersey, a 56-room mansion that would rival something you would see in Newport, Rhode Island. So another interesting Buffalo to New York connection. Mary Robertson Wittenberg, who I don't have a photo of, but she is from Buffalo, South Buffalo, and West Seneca. She was a great runner. She ended up becoming the president of the New York Road Runners Club, which of course runs the New York City Marathon. She grew that event to 50,000 participants. They raised $35 million for charity. I think 300 million people tune in on TV to watch the race, and she's still considered one of the most important female sports administrators. So I'll close out. One of the nice things about doing presentations like this, normally I speak to audiences in Buffalo and Rochester, but knowing that there might be somebody from New York that would watch this really kind of forced me to kind of think of some things. And one of the themes that kept coming up as I did this presentation is, wow, the Buffalo, New York connections are incredible. Certainly, now that I look back, I see that I think the Buffalo Irish definitely benefited from being part of the Empire State, the wealthiest, most powerful state for much of the 19th and 20th century. The proximity to New York City, there were so many collaborations in the Irish independence and political movements between politicians from Buffalo and New York City. And I kind of tried to imagine, like, would this same group, if you had dropped them in Dubuque, Iowa, nothing against Dubuque, Iowa, I'm sure there's some very successful people that have come out of Dubuque, but would they have achieved the same success? And I think of General Donovan going to college in Columbia, meeting FDR. If he doesn't do that, does he become the founder of the CIA? Chauncey Alcott going to New York because it's so close, Kitty O'Neill, people like that. Tim Russert getting hooked up with Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan and then getting a TV career out of that, etc. So those are just some of the names that I listed there that have connections, Buffalo to New York City or New York City area connections. So yeah, it was something interesting that I didn't put in my book, but it's definitely going to sit with me for a while. So. Here are the covers of my two books, Emerald Thread, the one that just came out in November, Against the Grain came out 12 years ago. That's about that mother community, the First Ward, which wasn't all Irish. There were enough Italians and Poles and Germans to make life interesting. But yeah, it's this real unique industrial residential neighborhood. And there's my email address if you have any questions. That's my website. All of the footnotes, I think there's 1,400 footnotes from Emerald Thread. They're all up on my website. So if you want to find out where I came up with these things, you can go there. And then a shameless plug, if you're interested in the books, both of them are available on barnesandnoble.com. And if you're not from the Buffalo area, but they're in the local bookstores here. And then just an image of JFK in the streets of Buffalo, one of his at least two trips to Buffalo. So thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for everybody that took the time to learn a little bit about what I find to be an interesting uh, community of Irish people in the United States.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I really appreciate it. I took copious notes, but I'm delighted to see we already have questions and comments. Maureen says, congratulations that she went to school with your Aunt Lucy in Detroit. And
Oh,
she's very informative, your talk. And Kelly says, so interesting to hear all the Buffalo, yeah, and NYC connections. I think that's absolutely right. Um, sorry, and then the question was for Mary Jane Cotter. Bravo and thank you for a brilliant presentation highlighting so many New York and national Buffalo connections and giving us many historical and present day insights. Question, are we still nurturing? Very good. The Buffalo NYC Emerald Thread. Good one.
Yeah. Well, that's a great two things, two answers to that. I would say is Governor Kathy Hochul and our Congressman Tim Kennedy have done wonders to try to keep those bonds both between Buffalo and New York City, as well as between Buffalo and Ireland. They both see the benefits to both communities to keep these strong ties. An example is Tim Kennedy working with Marcino Mueller, the publisher of the Irish Echo. We're now going to have the third awards ceremony for the Irish Echo Awards in Buffalo. It's something that wouldn't have happened in the past, and it's really neat to see these bonds continue.
Yeah, I met both of them when I worked up in Albany, and obviously I've met the governor down here too. But Senator Kennedy or Congressman Kennedy, now he used to be Assembly member, I think,
I
but
know.
Congressman, yeah,
Right.
does a fantastic work. And that whole, to have the James Joyce collection is amazing. I think it's something that, not to mind New York City, Dublin would even be jealous of it.
Yes. Right.
Um, so I was interested, Tim, they're all thanking you. Jackie says, thank you. Fantastic presentation and research. Oh,
Thank
and Jackie does have a question. What topic has captured your attention next? Oh,
Well, this is probably going to be my second and last book. Um, One thing that really fascinates me is uh, that I think I would like to get involved with is the one of the cemeteries in Buffalo, where many of these people are buried. Maybe do some kind of tour where I could share the knowledge I've learned, and yeah, I love cemeteries and love kind of telling stories. So that would be something I would do. But yeah, there won't be another book project, but I will keep the Irish history alive in some way. So that's one thing that I'm thinking of. Yeah. Great
good.
question.
Well, and I was thinking when you were reading, I mean, of course, the immigrant story is so sort of familiar to us, in cycles with different groups. So you could substitute, Irish for maybe Italian or Chinese or African American later on.
Right.
It was very telling when you said that 20% of the population at any one time was Irish, but up to 50%, and higher were either on welfare or, overly kind of represented in the penal system, and that. Can you talk a little bit about that? We're doing, as some of you may know, a series at the moment to accompany our exhibition of Great Hunger sculptures that we have on loan to us from the Quinnipiac collection and Ireland's Great Hunger Museum at Fairfield. But one of the speakers that I'm hoping to have in maybe April or May talks about epigenetics and this kind of imprint, of
Right.
trauma that it can leave on the psyche for 3 or 4 generations. Um, so I suppose, will you talk a little bit about that, your own ancestors came over during the Great Hunger. So aside from maybe the features that they're leaving in Ireland, is there or are there issues in Buffalo around, and you talked a little bit about the nativist movement, but unemployment or adjusting to life in a city rather than a town or farming. How does all of that play out, do you think, in Buffalo?
So yeah, I mean, I know from my own ancestor that the one that came from Skibbereen in the famine, little bits that we know. He never learned to read or write. Worked until he died, I think at age 70 as a grain scooper. Would get very angry when his grandchildren would ask questions about Ireland. He would say, "America's the greatest country. Like, don't ask me those questions." Um, and I find that interesting hearing those stories just from the guy that shares my same name, even though now, we look at Ireland, with a lot of nostalgia and, some people long to go back to Ireland. So yeah, I think that's interesting. Yeah, I do know a little bit about epigenetics. That has also, especially when it comes to, strains of alcoholism, anger, does that trauma keep getting passed on generation to generation? I hope that we can find out more about it. It's a little bit over, my head. I do know a person that's one of their expertise, and she says yes, these things can be passed on. Certainly, issues with, hunger and obesity, things like that. You can actually physically change the genes. So that is a really interesting emerging topic.
Mhm. And so, just in your own ancestor's case, did he know somebody that was in Buffalo, or did they come? I think you said he moved to Albany. Was that the same people?
Yes.
Yeah, they
Good.
came to Albany 1st.
Yeah, so his it's either a cousin or an in-law with the last name of Driscoll. The Driscolls, of course, came from the same area, County Cork, Baltimore, Skibbereen area. Had first settled. He was an undertaker, and my great-great-grandfather, I think, follows him. He buys a plot of land that's owned by and around the corner from this Timothy Driscoll. And then other Bowen ancestors, his cousins, come from Goleen. So at one point on O'Connell Avenue in the First Ward, there are at least four people with the name Daniel Bowen because you have these cousins and then sons and fathers on one street. I don't, and so everybody in the First Ward had to get a nickname because you couldn't keep everybody straight. So that's an interesting thing. Yeah. So there was that kind of chain migration that we know about. Yeah, in my own family as well.
And Tim, those areas that you showed us, those districts, did they become kind of ghettoized, or I mean, so much of the work that other historians have done, in Boston and Chicago and New York, it talks about the parish and the parish identity. And, as they get a little bit kind of wealthier, there's this, we hate the term, but white flight, where they leave an area that they had originally settled in. Do you notice that in Buffalo too? Like, or do the Irish get stuck? And I say stuck, maybe the area got better, sort of it might have been a ghetto back in the day, but what does that migration within the city look like over the years?
Great question. So the more affluent the Irish with skills tended to move to the west side
Mm,
of Buffalo. That neighborhood kind of collapses after a couple of generations. Italians, then Puerto Ricans. Now it's African and Asian immigrants. The first ward really stays strongly Irish even up until this day. It's still kind of looked at as the mother community. It's gone through a huge renaissance in the last couple decades. And South Buffalo is the neighborhood that really formed around 1900. So the people that left, they wanted to get away, possibly from the industrial neighborhood of the first ward. They moved into South Buffalo, which is still kind of a strong, very, very strong Irish neighborhood. Didn't get ghettoized at all. The Canal District, where there were many Irish that just kind of fell apart more from just changes in the landscape of Buffalo, not so much. So yeah, it might be a little bit different here in Buffalo. So that one neighborhood, as I mentioned, the West Side, yeah, that's a whole nother interesting story because that, unlike the first ward in South Buffalo, didn't stay homogenous. It just continues to be kind of an incubator for new immigrants. But the other
mm,
ones have still stayed, pretty strong
mm.
Irish strongholds.
And do you see, Tim, the same kind of career trajectory? Like in one hand, Tyler Ambender's new work is showing that, particularly that great hunger generation, and we tend to forget like the immigrant class is almost always the entrepreneurial class. They open little restaurants or bodegas, or back in the day, peddlers, carts, that kind of thing. Um, but Timothy Marr talks about the civil service, and so there, so many go into like the cops and firemen and sanitation workers, or of course politics. Do you see that trend up there too, where they're like father and son generations go into the same business?
Absolutely. So in my own family,
Mm,
start out as a grain scooper. His son gets an eighth grade education, becomes a fireman. Then my grandfather becomes an executive at the post office. My father was an executive at the post office here in Buffalo. Now I'm in the business world. So my paternal ancestors, that's exactly the trajectory. My maternal ancestors, it was a little bit different situation. My great great grandfather that came over in 1849 came over when he was 10 with a friend of his, and he gets a little schooling. He works as a clerk. He then becomes the president of the Livestock Association. Owns, a business dealing in, livestock in Buffalo. Very, very prosperous career. So. Yeah, so kind of I've seen in my own family kind of two different trajectories, and also on my maternal side, they got into the monument business and did a lot of the great monuments in Buffalo. So I think it depends on where you came from. My paternal ancestors, a lot of them came from County Cork, the areas hard hit by the famine, and then my maternal ancestors, Kilkenny, Roscommon and had a different experience.
You imagine a 10-year-old coming out with, like, we don't let them cross the street practically on their own at 10 now, you know?
It's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
mind-boggling. Yeah, and I
yeah,
don't even want to know what he had to leave
yeah,
to do that. It's
yeah.
just yeah,
Or,
mind-boggling.
the parents at home that hadn't the option but thought it was better for him, oh God, it's frightening.
Yeah.
Just to tell you, Mick O'Connor says thank you, Tim, for an excellent presentation, which was so informative. Best, and Michael Tenney, great presentation. He loves hearing about the old First Ward South Buffalo stories, the home of our parents and grandparents.
Oh,
Um, yeah, so he says, I hope to see you at the Buffalo Irish Centre or Blackthorn someday, Michael. I can guess what the Blackthorn is,
yeah.
Michael and Denise Tenney. So the other thing I wanted to just touch briefly because I loved there was that connection between New York City and Buffalo, but it seems like the politics and the entertainment, like somebody like Pasteur, Tony Pasteur to be up and down and recruiting these people like at the height of vaudeville and then Tin Pan Alley, and Kitty O'Neill was very famous in her day, and of course Chauncey Alcott, we still know today.
Yep.
Was there a sense like did Pasteur start up at that end, or was he, scouting for vaudeville?
Boy, that's a great question. I don't know if I know Kitty O'Neill in her early years was traveling throughout the United States with her mother. So I'm assuming she got a reputation for being one of the best dancers in the country. It's funny. How does word travel? Did she
Yeah,
perform in New York? Did somebody say, "Hey, you got to hire this woman"?
yeah.
She gets in a bidding war where she gets hired away, like as I mentioned, up in Boston. She comes back to work for Edward. I think his name is Harrigan. Uh,
Oh yeah, Harriet
yeah,
and Hart, I think. Yeah.
yeah, right,
Hmm.
exactly.
Oh
So
wow.
yeah, it's really, really interesting. We're talking, the 1870s, 1880s, and to see this young woman so successful. But yeah, I don't know how the word. I do know Michael Shea, who was the greatest impresario to come from Buffalo. We still have Shea's theaters all
Oh,
over. He would regularly go to New York and scout talent and then offer them more money to come and perform in Buffalo. So I'm
Buffalo. Wow.
assuming up and down, Railroad, take the
Yeah.
New York Central, and you would see what the talent was
Yeah.
and
And I
try to.
mean, like it feels like it's a long journey today. I can't imagine. In 1900 it must have been horrific.
Well,
Yeah.
Chauncey Alcott, in one of his performances, I found a program with all of his tour dates, 61 different cities in the age, and this was throughout North America and the United States. It was all done by train, and sometimes he
Yeah.
was performing twice. He would do a matinee and then an evening show.
Yeah.
Just remarkable. Yeah,
Yeah, they
no
were made
private.
of stern stuff back then, weren't they?
They were.
Yeah. Am I right in thinking Kitty's career ended kind of while she was still young? There's a second Kitty O'Neill who's not a dancer, and I think they kind of get conflated sometimes.
They do.
Yeah.
Yeah, she does. She comes back to Buffalo. She goes out to San Francisco, wows the Irish crowds out there. Comes back to Buffalo, and she gets some negative reviews, sadly, about her looks, that
Oh,
she wasn't the same. So she So she retires in Buffalo after those bad reviews. But she had saved up enough money. She was thrice married, had two very bad first husbands. Happily married the third time. Gets what they call some female ailment. Goes in for surgery to the hospital, and unfortunately passes away in her 30s. But
Oh,
left her
no.
family very well off with her properties. And yeah, really, really interesting story. A lot of myths about her that she had danced naked on a stool in
Yeah.
Canal Side. Another historian disproved that and said she couldn't have because she was in Chicago, giving birth to a baby. I think she had two children that did not survive. So, but yeah, really, really fascinating character. I
Yeah.
really liked researching her.
Yeah, well, and it's amazing. Like I'm trying to think because her costume is revealing, by the standards, even though it's not quite burlesque, So
Yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, they certainly didn't dress in. It looks like kind of knickerbockers almost, or dance. I mean, in Ireland, but it was to see, I presume, her feet. I mean, God knows today the Irish dancing dresses are very short, So it's to
yeah.
watch the legs, But it looks a
Oh,
little bit salacious, for that time.
yeah, and I
Yeah.
think, like I said, it was weird to read that the New York City working class boys,
Mm.
were obsessed with her. So yeah, there was
Yeah,
definitely,
yeah, I'm not
uh,
surprised. Sure,
yeah,
just a fright to see an ankle, not to mind a thigh,
exactly.
So listen, this was brilliant. I think, I love these kind of case studies of cities because a
Yeah,
lot of the story is universal, but there are of course always variations. And I think the New York state, especially, is such a big state, and the Erie Canal, that invasion of Canada is absolutely, I mean, I say hilarious, but it's it's kind of serious too, that they thought they could carry it off, So
yeah,
there's fascinating points to their history, I think, in Buffalo. And it's good to see that the spirit is still being kept alive because I suppose the ethnicity in one way is more and more diluted. You're hardly getting modern day immigration from Ireland up there,
that's
Yeah,
exactly right. And now you have people that might have the last name Murphy, but they're only 1/8 Irish or one
yeah,
sixteenth Irish. And yeah, it's
yeah,
really it's changing quickly. And that was one of the reasons I wrote this book, is I wanted to capture some of these
yeah,
stories before things got lost. And so that 100 years from now, people could say, well, what did the Irish do for us? And, you know,
yeah,
and then it'll be recorded. So I think
yeah,
there's a lot more of these secondary cities like Buffalo histories that need to be recorded and told, and there's definitely an audience for it. So if anybody's listening and has this idea, go for it.
yeah, yeah. I was amazed at Utica, like how much, because everyone, or certainly when I was living in Albany, we all thought of the Italians, but
Yeah,
there's so much Irish history to Utica that it was kind of, it is a pity to lose it. And I think too, you're right, even in Albany, the amount of people that I knew who were maybe in their 60s or 70s who remembered their grandparents talking with an accent, but their grandkids obviously won't, and so, but it's great that you have that story. Like, what a fantastic quote that your grandfather remembered from his grandfather, about don't be talking about Ireland, America is the greatest country. And
that's right.
so, people forget that there is sometimes a reluctance on the part of the immigrant to talk about home, because there's all sorts of, complex feelings and guilt and misery that you've gone, and maybe if you're illiterate you can't keep in touch, so there's, or of course people might have died with the great hunger at home. So that was fantastic work, Tim. I think it's very, very important, and I'm delighted we had you on. um as I say, keep an eye. I'm not sure when we're next online. With the next three events are all in-house, and then we're certainly have a couple of online Great Hunger talks, including one that I'll be giving, a case study of the Great Hunger in my hometown, Listowel, which is in County Kerry. And again, I chose that because I knew it, but also because Listowel is one of the 130 workhouses, that opened in the early 1840s. And we're not as famous as Kilrush or Skibbereen or these kind of horror towns, but there are 4,000 people at least buried in the workhouse grave. And so our town could be a kind of a proxy for any town,
Yeah,
in the famine. So keep an eye, everyone. I really appreciate you joining us tonight. Super cold evening, and we look forward to celebrating Irish American Heritage Month in March. So keep an eye on these talks, and I'm sure we'll have you back, Tim, to talk about something else.
I would love that. Thank you so much for
Great.
this
That's
opportunity.
all.
All
Take
right.
care. Good
Take
night,
care.
everyone. Thank
Good
you.
night.
Bye bye.